Today's daf is daf Yud Beis. On the top of the Amud, Omar Shmuel, Mekable Kibolet. So we spoke about Kablanut, where you contract a person and you pay him not per hour or per day, you pay him for the final product. Are you allowed to organize such a contract on Chol Moed? B'toch hatchum asur. If the work is going to take place within the city or the city limits within 2,000 am around the city, then it's asur. Such a contract with non-Jews who will perform on Shabbos on behalf of a Jew, those non-Jews, in the eyes of the onlooker, are hired on Shabbos itself, which you're not allowed to hire workers on Shabbos, even non-Jewish workers. But if the work will take place outside the city limits, that's 2,000 amma outside the city limits, then it's mutter. Basically, that's called sinna. We don't assume that any Jews will be aware of the fact that the Gentiles are working on their behalf outside the city, outside the tchum. So if the work is taking place within the tchum, then we're not going to allow that to take place on Shabbos. And everyone's going to see the work that's being done on behalf of the Jew, and they'll identify it as work that's being done, work that was hired during Shabbos for the Jew. That's prohibited. And Rav Papa says, over Rav Papa, Vafilu chutz l'tchum, there's no carte blanche, blanket heter, even if the work of the non-Jew is being performed outside the tchum. Lo amar and ella, we have the following restriction: to leka masa de mekarvi lahasa. You might have another Jewish city that's on the other side of this city, but it might be beyond 2,000 amma of the city where you live, but it's within 2,000 amma of the nearby city. And in such a case, the Jewish people in the nearby city will be assuming that you hired these workers on Shabbos. Excuse me, if there's a Jewish city close to that place, in other words, it's within the tchum of that second city, then you're not allowed to have non-Jews work for you on Shabbos, because Jews of the other city, seeing them working, will assume that they were hired on Shabbos. Amar Rav Misharshia. I'm going to restrict this heter, this leniency, even further. Even in a situation where there is no nearby city that's within the Tchum Shabbos of where the Goyim are working, lo amaran, we're not going to allow this to go on. We don't expect people to be outside of the Tchum, and therefore it's tzina. No one's going to come to suspect that these workers were hired on Shabbos. Moed, people are constantly moving from place to place on Chol Moed. And it's common for people to be on the move. The asula hasam, and they will come to there, and therefore it's asa. It's no longer tzina. It's not something private. We cannot allow the non-Jews to work in that situation of Chol Moed. Somebody seeing them will assume that they were hired on Chol Moed, and you're not allowed to hire workers, even non-Jewish workers, to work on your behalf on Chol Moed. And this prohibition applies not just to work on something that's tolush min hakarka, but even to karka itself. Let's say buildings or land. And generally speaking, when it comes to movable property that's metaltalin, no one really identifies who's the owner of these metaltalin. If they see a guy working and fixing something, then we can assume that it belongs to someone else, perhaps to another non-Jew. We don't have to assume it belongs to a Jew. But if, on the other hand, we're talking about karka, real estate, everybody knows who owns the real estate. It's public knowledge that it's owned by a Jew. And therefore, we have this problem that the onlooker thinks that the non-Jewish workers were hired on Chol Moed to do this work. Mar Zutra Bereder of Nachman, Bonule Apadra. Apadra is a mansion. Mekable Kiboles, with a contract that they would pay when the work is completed. Chutz l'tchum, and the work was done outside of the city and beyond 2,000 amos. So according to the strict letter of the law, this should be mutter, but Ikla, Rav Safar, Rav Huna Bar Chanina, when they visited Velo Ol Gabe, they refused to enter into the mansion on Shabbos. They didn't want to benefit from malach that was done by a guy on Shabbos on behalf of a Jew. Ikad Yamri, Hunami Lo Ol Lagabe, even Mar Zutra himself would not enter into the mansion for the same reason. They didn't want to benefit from work that was done illegally by a guy on Shabbos on behalf of a Jew. So the Gemara asks, V'hamar Shmuel, doesn't this contradict the statement on the top of the Amud of Shmuel that Makabli Kiboles b'tochat tchum asa b'chutz l'tchum is mutter? So Mar Zutra's mansion was built outside the tchum. According to Shmuel, that's mutter. Why did they not enter? Adam chashiv shiny. The Gemara explains, and we'll see this principle over and over again throughout the daf, that when people look up to another person, his standards have to be very high. He has to be more stringent than the letter of the law and go beyond the letter of the law, because people think that if these greats and these prominent people are entering into the mansion, then there's no problem. You're allowed to have a guy work for you on Shabbos. They don't realize that this was mutter because it was built, in such a way that it avoids the Easter. And again, it's a little bit odd. Why would the common people not realize that the building was done outside of the Tchum Shabbos? What's going to lead them to draw the wrong conclusions that the prominent ones are allowed to have Gentiles build inside the Tchum? It was built outside the Tchum. But I guess they wanted to be extremely strict about it. Ika Diamri, another version has it, that Siyua Sayeya Betivna Ba'adayu, that the straw, which is called Tevin, was supplied by Mar Zutra. And he had no clue that the guy would build this on Shabbos. They did it without notifying him. And at this point, it's more of a participation on the part of the Jew in the malacha of the guy, because the cheftza, the straw itself that was being used for bricks, belonged to the Jew. And that means the Jew, in a sense, is participating and benefiting from this malacha that's being done on Shabbos. So therefore, even though the work was done outside the Tchum, since Mar Zutra, according to this Ikad Diamri, was participating with the contractors, the Goyim, then it really looks like they're working on his behalf. Rav Chama Sharalahu La'avun Gare de Beresh Galusa. So we're talking now about something called Abungare, which is literally translated into English as table stewards. So it seems like these are people who repair tables. That's their job. And Rav Chama allowed the Goyim to work on behalf of the Reish Galusa on Chol Moed, lemevid lehu avida b'chula de Moed, and they were doing malachos on behalf of the Reish Galusa on Chol Moed. Omar, he declared, Kevan diagar lo ka shakli, this is a different kind of a contract. They were not paid in cash, but rather they were paid with meals. They would eat food as payment. That was the form of payment that they used to pay these workers. And therefore, it's such an indirect way of paying them. Sharshuye hudukam sharshuye. They're getting an indirect benefit, v'leslan ba, and therefore this is not considered malacha asura when it's done on behalf of the Jew. So work that was performed by these stewards was permitted on Chol HaMoed because the tables they were repairing were needed during Chol HaMoed, so it's called Tzarchei HaMoed. Again, we still can't pay them directly for their work because that's not something that's appropriate for a day that's invested with Kedusha Hayom. It's Uvda D'Chol, it's a weekday activity. But if they're indirectly benefiting by taking meals from the owner, that's not considered Uvda D'Chol, and therefore it's mutter. Tana Rabbana, we learned in the Brayso, Makablim Kiboles, again, that's the contractual agreement that you pay for the final product after it's finished, after it's completed. Moed, La Sosol Yachar Moed. So they set up an agreement that the work should be done after the Moed. Ubemoed also. They're not allowed to do work on Chol HaMoed, even though the contractual agreement was set up in a way that it's not necessary for the workers to work on Chol HaMoed, but the agreement in the contract was entered into on Chol HaMoed. That's prohibited. Klol shel davar koshu oseh omer lenachri v'oseh. Anything that you're allowed to do in Chol HaMoed, you're allowed to tell a guy to do it on your behalf. Kol she'eino oseh eino omer lenachri. He's not allowed to tell the nachri to do on Chol HaMoed what he himself is not allowed to do. Tanya idach. We have another brayso. Mekablin kibolos b'moed la'sosel yachar moed. You are allowed to contract with a non-Jew to do work b'kablanut after the moed. So on the moed, you are setting up a contract for after the moed. Bilvad shelo yimdod v'shelo yishkol v'shelo yimneh. There's no measuring going on, no weighing going on, no counting going on. So as we said earlier, there are certain activities that are uvda d'chol, they're not appropriate for Chol HaMoed. And here we have a list of 3 of those types of activities. So there are many activities that you generally get involved in when you contract with a non-Jew. For example, if, let's say, you're giving him thread to weave, then you might weigh the thread, or, for example, you might count pieces of clothing to give it to a launderer. Measuring, weighing, and counting are regarded as uvda d'chol, and they're not appropriate activities for Chol HaMoed. We learned to the Brayso, ein marbiyim behema b'chol shel moed. Here's another activity that is considered tircha yisera. It's not a malacha per se, and it's prohibited on Chol HaMoed unless it's absolutely necessary. And we're talking about mating, mating, which means marbia behema, when you mount a male on top of a female, or the opposite, a female on top of a male. And these matings are forbidden on Chol HaMoed. It's called tircha yisera. It has no tzorech hamoed. It can be accomplished just as well after the moed. We have a similar halacha that has nothing to do with Chol HaMoed per se. Kayotze b'zeh ein marbiyim b'bechar v'lo b'psuli mukdashim. So bechar means the firstborn male of a kosher animal. And the Torah says in Dvarim Tesvav, lo savod b'bechar. You're not allowed to work with the bechar. It has kedushas bechar, mirechem imo, with its leda. And when you put one such bechar, a male, and you, what word do I want to use it, mounted on top of a female, then you're actually doing avoda with the male. And then we have psuli mukdashim, which means that, let's say, an animal was a zevach, it was designated as a zevach for the mizbech, and then it got a mum, and now you could be the balas mum, but there still is a vestige of kedusha, an iser giza and avoda with regard to the original animal, even after it's pidyon. And so again, we have an iser avoda, and we're going to say that larbia, to mount and mate, is called an avoda. Again, the achronim here go to town why the Brisa would have compared these two dinim that are so fundamentally different one from the other. In any event, we go on. Tanya, either we have another Brisa, Moed. We don't mount a male animal on a female animal on Chol Moed. The mating is considered a Turchi Yisera. Yehuda Omer, Chamora Shetava. Oh, this is an interesting animal psychology here. You have a female donkey that has a certain desire to have a relationship with a male donkey. And this is a dangerous situation. If we don't allow and facilitate the male-female relationship, it's going to be very detrimental for the female. Is Marbiyim Oleh Zachar. We're allowed in such a case to mount a male onto a female, which is normally prohibited on Chol Moed, Bishvil Shalot Titztanen, because if she has this heat, this desire, and then she cools off, then it's not going to be good. If the desire of a female animal goes unsatisfied, it is difficult thereafter to mate her. And therefore we have a Davra Ovid, and it spells a very significant financial loss, and therefore we're going to be mat. Even on Chol Moed. Sharkal Abemos, Machnisin Oson Le Bikaros. Now, female animals, if they, with the exception of a female donkey, if they go into heat, then we're allowed to put them into the corral together with males, but they'll be mating on their own. You're not mounting the male on the female. And that's permitted on Chol Moed. Now, what about bringing animals into a field in order for them to create manure? Are we allowed to do that on on Chol Moed? We don't pen animals in a field for the purpose of manuring the field, if they're defecating in the field. Even on Chol Moed, this is considered as an uvda de chol. It's not appropriate for Chol Moed. On Shabbos and Yom Tov, it's forbidden as a tolda of either plowing or planting. But here, it's not a tolda, and it's not a malacha, but it's considered uvda de chol. But in Ba Me'aleh Mutter, if let's say, the animals were brought by, let's say, non-Jews, or they came on their own volition into the field, then you allow this to go on, and even though they will be manuring the field, it's okay, but so as long as you're not actively involved in assisting the movement of the animals from one part of the field to another. Let's say, for example, the guy is working on behalf of a Jew, and the Jew wants to assist him by providing him with a watchman, a shomer, to guard the flock. If the Jew assists the non-Jews by providing a watchman for them, it would appear that he hired them on Chol Moed to do this work. Hoye schir Shabbos, schir Chodesh, schir Shana, schir Shavua. Let's say you hire a non-Jew for a year, or per week, per month, or for a 7-year period of time. And there was so you hired him to manure the Jews' fields whenever it's necessary. You didn't specify that he should work on Shabbos, or on Yom Tov, or on Chol Moed. Most of them shomer l'nairis sonam. So in this case, you can actively be involved in assisting these workers. So since he was hired for a long period of time, and there was no specific time that was designated for his work, then he's deciding, the guy, to work at his own pace, according to his own schedule, his own calendar, and therefore he's not working for the Jew on Shabbos. It's totally for himself. He's working for himself, for his own convenience. Rebbe Omer b'Shabbos b'tova, b'yonta b'mizonos, b'moed b'schar. We said that if the non-Jew brings on his own accord animals into the field of a Jew in order for them to manure the field, then that's mutter, because the guy is working on his own accord. But Rebbe says that on Shabbos, we're only allowed to permit the Gentiles to manure the field if they expect some sort of a favor, but not payment. For example, he's going to represent, the guy, or give food to the guy, or something along that line. Or on Yontif Mizonos, he provides them with food, but there's no monetary wages, no payment of cash. And on Chol Moed, we're going to be even more makel. We're going to allow, in this case, since again the non-Jew came on his own accord, to pay the non-Jew, with monetary payment. There was never an agreement by the Jew beforehand to pay him for work that he does on Chol Moed. After he completes the work, the Jew will pay him. And the big chiddush here of Rebbe is that we're not afraid that he's going to come back, this guy, to do this work on a regular basis, and it looks like the Jew had hired him. Omer Rav Yosef Hilchasa ki Rebbe, we're going to paskin like Rebbe, and it seems from this statement of Rav Yosef that Tanakama disagrees with Rebbe. And the Tanakama holds that when the non-Jews come of their own accord to manure the field, whether it's on Shabbos, on Moed, on Chol Moed, you're allowed to pay them for their work. And we don't have this restriction and limitation that Rebbe set down that you have to pay them in a different form. And this is implicit in the fact that Tanakama simply says that when non-Jews come on their own, then it's permissible. There were no stipulations or conditions added. The Mishnah says, "V'chein mishe hoya yeno misoch habar." We're going to have again a repeat of a previous machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi. We had it earlier in the Mishnah with regard to olives that he turned over, and now he has to press them in order to complete the work. Otherwise, the shemen, the oil coming out of the olives, might spoil. And the question was there whether we're allowed to use it. You're allowed to do this crushing of the olives in a normal way, without a shinu. And in the case of Yayin here, which is addressed in our Mishnah, he's got wines in a vat in front of his wine press, and he wants to pour the wine into barrels. And according to Rabbi Yossi, he's going to have to do it with a shinu, an unusual way. Now we have a case of Ero Avel, so he became a mourner, and again he's not allowed to do malacha or ones, or the wine was standing ready in the vat before Yontif, but he couldn't pour it into the barrels because of some situation that arose, an unavoidable mishap, oshetu, or perhaps the workers deceived him. Is in all those cases, Zolev v'gomer v'gof kidarko. Now, here we have to ask the following question. when he pours the wine into the barrels, even though there's no malacha, then normally this would be forbidden because of tircha. So again, just the action of transferring the wine into the barrels is considered tircha, and in and of itself would be asar and chol moed. And to do a magufas hachavis, meaning to seal the barrel, that's also an extra exertion, and it might even involve a malach of memache. So we're going to allow him to complete the pressing out of the wine from the grapes. And it means that this is different than the shemen case. Let's go back for a moment and take a look at the case of shemen. Mishahafach has Zeisov. So it was Rabbi Yossi was Mekil, and he allowed to do it in Darko. So this is Rabbi Yossi Luchitoso. Sole for Gomer V'Gof Kedarko. Rabbi Yehuda, who had said in the previous Mishnah that Meinicho Liachar Moed, here he says Osalo Limudim B'Shvil Shelo Yachas. So it seems like he's allowing the pouring of the wine into the barrel, but as far as Magifa is concerned, meaning to seal the barrel, he's only going to allow it in a temporary way by putting boards on top of the barrel of wine. And that will guarantee that the wine doesn't spoil. But he's not allowed to seal it in the normal way. So again, Rabbi Yehuda's machmir, like he was in the previous Mishnah with regard to shemen, but in yayin he's more prone to be maker. Rabbi Yehuda permits the minimum amount of work necessary to prevent the wine from souring, and therefore a temporary cover over the barrels with boards would suffice. Rabbi Yossi holds that once we allowed him to begin the process of sealing the wine in the barrel, then we're going to allow him to complete the work in a normal way. Even though, again, the difference is very minimum in terms of financial loss, but that's enough according to Rabbi Yossi to be maker. The Gemara says, Utsricha, why do we need the two Mishnayos? Both of which record a machlok between Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda. The Iyashmin Kamais, if we only had the case of the olive and the oil coming out of the olives, by he come Rabbi Yossi, that's where Rabbi Yossi was makil, and he didn't require any sort of shinui, do the malacha kedarka, mishum, the michchad nafesh pseda. Because relative to wine, shemen is very expensive. And we consider it a serious davar avud, loss of finance, of money. And that's Rabbi Yossi's kula in the Mishnah in Shemen. But Avol Chamer in our Mishnah, the case of wine, lo nafesh pseda, there's not such a serious loss of finances, either because yayin is relatively cheaper or because it won't spoil that much. Ema modile Rabbi Yehuda, maybe we would have thought without our Mishnah that Rabbi Yehuda would convince Rabbi Yossi, and Rabbi Yossi would be machmir. Iyashmina basraisa, just the flip way, if we only had the second Mishnah of yayin, our Mishnah by Hikam or Rabbi Yehuda, we would have assumed that Rabbi Yehuda's machmir here and requires the boards as opposed to the sealing of the barrel. Aval Bahana, but in the case of oil in the previous Mishnah, where the loss is very significant and it becomes a davar of it, I would have thought Model Rabbi Yossi Sricha. So we need the Mishnah teaches both wine and oil. Rav Yitzchak bar Abba, man tana shinui b'moed b'davra avud. Who is the Tana who requires a shinui to perform the work in an unusual way, even though he's trying to prevent a financial loss, so that work that's performed to prevent the loss still requires a shinui? Delok Rabbi Yossi. That's not like Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi is the one who says that you're allowed to do the malacha kedarka if it's a davar of no need for shinu. Rav Yosef halacha Rabbi Yossi. We paskin like Rabbi Yossi, and this is a Gemara in Eruvin on Daf Mem Vav. That in Machlok Shin Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi, we always paskin like Rabbi Yossi. Bo mi name Rav Nachman Yitzchak ma'ul meisha chavisa de shikra bechula demoed. Chula demoed means chol hamoed. Are we allowed to seal a barrel of beer on chol hamoed? Beer is something that needs a tight cover in order to prevent it from spoiling. Amalahu, Sinai Omar Halacha ki Rabbi Yosef. Sinai is an acronym for Rabbi Yosef, and he paskin like Rabbi Yosef, that you're allowed to seal the barrel, and that's in the case of the wine. And Rav Nachman is assuming that the same would apply to beer. So the Gemara rejects it. Amar de Rabbi Yossi b'chamra. In the case of wine, where he's going to take a serious loss of finance, then Rabbi Yossi doesn't require any shita. But b'shikra, in the case of a barrel of beer, mi Amar, do we know? Can we conclude what Rabbi Yossi would say? Maybe here he would be machmir. But chamra, my time of my, why was he making in the case of wine, and he permits you to pour the wine into barrels on chol hamoed mishum denafish pseida? It's a very significant loss. But shikra nami iste pseida. In the case of beer, there's not so much of a potential financial loss, but nevertheless there is a financial loss, and therefore perhaps Rabbi Yossi would be makil in chamra the same way he was. He would be makil in shikra, the same way he was makil in chamra. The Amar Abaye, and Abaye is going to indicate what kind of a loss financially could a person suffer in the case of beer if he doesn't seal the barrel of beer. Barshis savi v'shaya. If you have 6 sa'a in a barrel of beer and you sell it, mibar tamne v'lo shaya, he will reap the benefits, or he will be paid a price that's equal to 8 saw of a barrel that's unsealed. So if you make the calculation, the ratio here is a loss of approximately 1/3. Depends on mila go, mila ra. So I'll have to forfeit 2 saws of beer for the benefit of a sealed barrel. So therefore we have a davar avud, and therefore it makes sense that Rabbi Yossi would be matir sealing a barrel of beer the same way that he was lenient and permitted the sealing of a barrel of wine. Amar Rav Chama bar Guri Amar Rav. Now we have a general statement about the laws of chol hamoed and how complex they are. Hilchos moed hilchos kusim baloch. Just like the kusim, we don't know exactly why they're machmir and they took upon themselves certain mitzvahs, and other mitzvahs they completely ignore the mitzvah. So there's no logic and rules that we can anticipate when the kusim will accept the authority of the Torah, when they won't, etc., etc. Because there are certain things that the kusim were even more meticulous than Jews. There are other things that they didn't observe at all. And in the case of Chol Moed, once again, it's very difficult to know exactly what the Chacham prohibited and what they permitted. Lamai Hilchah says, why are you telling me this? Omar of Daniel Bar Katina Marav, Lomar Shehena Kuros, V'ein Lemedo Zumizu. The laws of Chol Moed are like barren women who only benefit their husbands in one way, but they cannot benefit their children, their offsprings, they're barren. And these laws of Chol Moed, one possesses only the law itself, but he cannot derive any future conclusions about it. Ein lemedo zu mizu, you can't derive one from the other. So you don't say that just like the Rabbanu were lenient in one form of work on Chol Moed, so too they would be lenient by analogy in a similar kind of work. The laws of Chol Moed, you cannot find a strict logical underpinning, and you cannot extrapolate from one case to another. Yomer Shmuel, Zoftim Kusta, V'ein Zoftim Chamita. So Shmuel makes the following subtle distinction. You're allowed to coat the inside of a jug with pitch on Chol Moed, but you're not allowed to coat the inside of a barrel with pitch on Chol Moed. So the difference is between the pitch inside a jug and the pitch inside the barrel, and you have to weigh how much tircha he has, how much of a loss he has. There's so many different factors, and you can differentiate one from the other. You're allowed to coat a barrel, and you're not allowed to coat a jug on Chol Moed. According to Rav Dimi, the main element is the loss financially, and therefore he's going to permit only coating a large barrel where you suffer a serious loss. Where Shmuel is concerned about tircha, and therefore, accordingly, he's only going to permit coating a smaller jug where there's less tircha. And when you learn Shmuel's permission and his heter to coat a jug, you're unaware of his reasoning. You might conclude that certainly it'd be permissible to coat a barrel where the financial loss is even greater. Or in the flip side, if you learn Rav Dimi and he's permitting you to coat a barrel, you might see how much more so can you coat a jug when there's so much less tircha involved. So we see that the halachas of Chol Moed cannot be subject to analogy and derive conclusions because you don't know really the inner mechanism of it. And Amar Abai Naktinon, we have a tradition that Hilchas Moed Hilchas Shabbos, that the laws of forbidden labor on Chol Moed are like the laws of forbidden labors on Shabbos. Yesh men poter avalasa. There are some that are only derabanan. Yesh men muter lechatchila. Others are muter even lechatchila. Okay, then, so we're up to now Daf Yud Beis Amud Beis, and Amir Hashem, we'll pick that up a little bit later on.